Good evening, everyone. A quick survey around the globe and the United States shows that freedom is on the wane in many ways, or simply never has been in many places. In Iran, we have young women being killed because the morality police and the Iranian regime feel that these women have violated Islamic law, have violated the dictates of Allah. In Ukraine, we have young men and women and families dying, being slaughtered by the Putin regime because Putin and company feel that the Ukrainians and the Russians are all one big collective of people. Individuals matter not, and he has the right, the authority to dictate and rule all of them. Back here in the United States, we have increasing spending, increasing regulations, and of course the increase in spending means that there has to be an increase in taxation, whether directly through taxes or indirectly through government printing of fiat money, which causes inflation, which causes all sorts of problems for people. And I could go on. There isn't a place on the planet that is not in a crisis with respect to freedom. The question is, how do we battle this problem? How do we bring freedom to more people, to ourselves, so that we can live as human beings? Human beings need freedom in order to live. We are rational animals. We survive by figuring out what's true, using our mind, using our rational faculty, and then acting on our best judgment to create values, produce goods and services, trade them with others, and do so voluntarily so that we can dictate our own lives and live as human beings. The question is, how do we fight for freedom against tyranny? And my question today specifically is, do we need philosophy in this battle? And if we do we need a particular philosophy, or will any philosophy do? To answer this question, I want to look at philosophy for just a brief time, just take a quick survey of what this thing is and how, if it does apply to the defense of liberty, how so? So we know what liberty is, we know what freedom is. It's the absence of physical force in social relationships so that we can act on our own judgment, produce goods and services, keep and use the product of our effort. What is philosophy? It's your basic worldview. It's your basic ideas about what is good and bad, right and wrong, and how people should and shouldn't act. That's morality, the centerpiece of philosophy. And then there are the two fundamental branches of philosophy. One about how we know what's true and how we can validate claims to truth and knowledge. And that's called epistemology. It's the branch that studies the nature and means of knowledge. And then there's the branch that studies the basic nature of reality. What kind of universe do we live in? What is real? What is not? And what is the basic characteristic of things that do exist, if anything exists? And that is called metaphysics. So these three branches, ethics or morality, I use those synonymously, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics are the basic ideas in philosophy. Do these ideas that we have on these issues, and by the way, everyone does have ideas. You have ideas in your mind about what's good and bad, right and wrong, and how people should and shouldn't act. And you have ideas about how we gain knowledge, where knowledge comes from, and how it's validated. And you have basic ideas about what kind of world we live in. What's the basic nature of this place? Is it governed by natural law, or are miracles possible? Can wishing make things so? Those kinds of questions. So people have a philosophy, whether they're fully and explicitly aware of it or not. And the big question is, do these ideas matter in defense of liberty? Well, let's put some on the table and see. In morality, one of the dominant, I would say the dominant idea today, certainly here in America, but also I think across the globe, is the idea that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving other people. This is what it means to be moral, to selflessly help others. And if you're helping others in a way that's benefiting you, if you're trading with others, so I give you some services and you pay me for those services, that's not moral. That's just an exchange where we both gain. The key, according to the morality of altruism, the idea that we should live for others, altruism, altura is Latin for other, altruism means otherism. The idea behind this morality, as the philosopher who coined the term, Auguste Comte, put it, is that we should live for others and that we should self-sacrificially serve others. That's what it means to be good. Well, if that's true, if it's true that being moral means selflessly serving others, how is that going to comport with, say, your right to act on your own judgment and keep the goods and services that you produce, or keep the wealth that you produce through production of goods and services? Is there any conflict there? Well, Auguste Comte himself pointed out the conflict, which is relatively obvious. If you have a duty, if you have a moral obligation, regardless of what you want to do, if it's morally that you must, to be moral, selflessly serve others, you can't simultaneously have a right to not selflessly serve others. You can't simultaneously have a right to pursue your values, make your own decisions about life, keep and use the product of your effort. These things are at odds, and as Comte put it, the theory of rights has to be thrown away if altruism is true. Rights have to be put away completely. So there's one issue there that looks pretty significant if you think about it, right? The idea of rights not existing if morality is what it is largely taken to be among people. Let's ask a question about this idea, though, that being moral consists in selflessly serving others. Is it true? Is it true that that's what being moral consists of? This kind of question brings us down into epistemology. We've asked now a question about what is true. Is there evidence to support this idea? If we look around, can we find evidence? Oh yeah, here's the evidence that means you must sacrifice for others to be moral. Well, I don't know of any evidence to support that idea. I doubt you know of any evidence to support that idea. It seems like rather more of an assertion. So how do we know what is true and whether this idea is true? The theory of knowledge. Is our basic means of knowledge evidence and logic in support of an idea, or is it the case that you can know by another means, by a non-rational means, by non-evidential means? For instance, faith. Is faith a means of knowledge? A lot of people think it is. That's the essence of religion, is the idea that you can know by means of faith. We have the two concepts, faith and reason, precisely because they mean different things. Knowing by reason or accepting ideas on the basis of reason means accepting them on the basis of evidence and conceptual integration on that basis and logic and that whole process. Faith, on the other hand, is precisely the acceptance of ideas in support of which there is no evidence. That's what the concept means. Is that a means of knowledge? Are feelings a means of knowledge? If you feel that it's true, is that a way of knowing? Is consensus a means of knowledge? If people agree on something, does that agreement make it so? So there are four options right there. There are more, but reason, faith, feelings, consensus, are these means of knowledge? Does it matter which of these we accept as a means of knowledge? Well, I think that Mahsa Amini would say, yes, it matters. The morality police had faith that she was violating Allah's laws as codified in the Iranian regime's laws. I think Salman Rushdie might think that the idea of faith being a means of knowledge on those same grounds is problematic. What about feelings as a means of knowledge? Oh, and I could go on with the faith about, homosexuals being thrown off of buildings and hung for the same reasons. What about feelings being a means of knowledge? Is there any evidence that the Ukrainian people are one big collective that is the same as the Russian people, and that the Putin regime is correct to rule all of them? Is there any evidence to support that? Or is this just Putin and company feel that they would like to do this, so they do it? Consensus. Is it true that consensus is a means of... What about the consensus in the antebellum South that slavery was perfectly fine? It was the consensus. Did that make it so? Epistemology matters. How we know what we know and how we can validate truth claims matters a whole lot, philosophically, and for liberty. I mentioned evidence before. What would that mean if evidence was necessary? Would there be something solid that I can see, touch, taste, hear, smell to support ideas if someone's making a claim? Can I access reality at all? Is there a reality out there? If so, what are its properties? And is there just one reality, or might there be more? This brings us to the question of metaphysics. What is the nature of this place in which we live, and this place in which we're trying to figure out how to defend freedom so that we can live? Is it governed by natural law? Is it true that things are what they are, the law of identity, as Aristotle and Ayn Rand and others have identified it, and that things can act only in accordance with their nature, so a rose can bloom or wilt, but it cannot speak? Right? Is that the case? Or are miracles possible? Is it possible that a rose could speak? Well, that might not seem like a big deal in terms of liberty, but I think if we push this a little further, we'll see that it might. If miracles are possible, why are they possible? If things can act in contradiction to their nature, then that means that government spending and government printing of fiat money could act in contradiction to its nature. It could be that this time, government spending and printing of fiat money won't cause inflation. Or is there something natural in the connection between those relationships? So is it true that there's a reality to which our ideas and our thoughts have to conform or not? Or, by the way, is there a second reality, a more real reality, like Plato's world of forms, or the Christian heaven where God resides and controls things, or Kant's noumenal world, a place we can't access, but where all of our moral knowledge somehow emanates into us? Are these real places, these extra realities that are supposed to be higher and more important than the one in which we live? Or is there just the one reality, the one that we see, touch, taste, exist in, and are trying to do this thing we call life in? And there's a third alternative. Is it maybe the case that there's no reality, that it's just all in here, man, as some put it, right? Everything's just made up, or everything's just a social construct. There's no such thing as a reality out there to which our ideas must conform. Well, if it is all just made up, if everything's just a social construct, then whatever a given society or culture chooses to do is fine. That's their reality. That's their reality. If in the antebellum South they want to have slaves, that's their reality. Who are you to judge that? If proletarian logic and bourgeois logic are different things and access different realities depending on your social, your economic status, then there's going to be a perpetual war between these two groups because they live in, access, and think from different realities, different places. This is just a brief indication of what philosophy is, what questions it ponders, and why it matters to us if we want to fight for liberty. I think everyone here knows we need liberty. We need to be free. It's fairly clear given the history of economic change in the past 100 years, and even prior to that, but certainly in the past 100 years, which is remarkably clear. We heard other speakers talking about this. It's also relatively clear that a human life is precisely a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind. This is why slavery is wrong, because it's a person lording it over another and saying, well, your mind doesn't matter to your life. My mind is going to tell you how to live your life. What's wrong with that? Well, if reality is whatever we make it in our minds, whatever we wish it to be or whatever a society wishes it to be, or if miracles are possible, maybe slavery is bad for you, but not for this guy. Well, why? Why would that not be the case if a miracle can happen? This guy doesn't need his mind to live. He might be human, but he can act in contradiction to his nature. So I don't have to go by the nature of human beings. In all of these cases, and in every other direction you think in terms of liberty and the ideas that undergird or undermine liberty, right, certain ideas support the idea that we should be free. Other ideas undermine and basically destroy the possibility of freedom. I want to share with you just a brief indication of a philosophy that I think is the full basis for the liberty movement. And this is the philosophy of my favorite author and my favorite philosopher, Ayn Rand. And in the various, in the three branches of philosophy that we have been talking about, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics, we can sum up her philosophy this way. In ethics, she says, the very reason that human beings need morality, or a code of values to guide our choices and actions, is that we're alive and we have to pursue values. We have to gain and keep things, everything from food, clothing, and shelter, to medicine and purpose and self-esteem, sort of spiritual values and medical values, on up to liberty and rule of law. All of these values, this whole constellation of values and all the values in between are things that we need to go after and get and keep in order to live. Other values would include friendship and love and joy, etc., the things that make us human. And because that is why we need values at all and why we therefore need a code of values, Rand points out that this need is rooted in the requirements of human life. The whole reason we need values is so that we can live, so that we can think clearly, produce things that we need, trade them with others as we need, and get the things that we need in order to thrive. So Rand flips the table on the traditional view or the conventional view of morality. And she says being moral doesn't consist in sacrificially serving others. It consists in pursuing values, creating values, respecting the rights of others to do the same, and then we can trade values with each other, and lo and behold, we can all prosper. Her ethics is controversial because it runs against the grain of 2,500 years of Judeo-Christian ethics, but it makes sense. And we don't run away from things because they're controversial and make sense, right? If this makes sense, it makes sense. So if you haven't looked into Rand's ethics, I urge that you do. I urge that you look into her ethics. A place to start there is to read her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, in which she talks about what altruism is, why it's problematic, why it is, as she calls it, the morality of death, the idea that giving up your values is the right thing to do. Well, where do you stop? You give them up and give them up, and you don't have any values, you die. She says the opposite is true. Not the opposite meaning you stab other people in the back to get what you want. That's not egoism, what she calls the proper morality. That's called predation. That's a very different thing. It's a third alternative, and it's wrong. But producing values, going after the values that you need to make your life wonderful, to keep you alive and to enable you to flourish, and then respecting the same needs of other people, that's how we live harmoniously together. That's how we can prosper, thrive, and live wonderful lives. It's also the basis for individual rights, because if it's true that we should pursue the values on which our lives depend, if that's the moral essence of morality, then it must also be true that politically speaking, we must be left free to do that thing. So we've got to have a legal system and a social system that says the initiation of physical force against human beings is wrong and it's properly illegal. Why? Because it's contrary to the requirements of human life, which is what morality is all about. So Rand's morality, as she calls it, is basically rational egoism. It's the idea, use your mind to pursue your values, and that's the basis for rights, which we have to respect among each other so that we can live. Rand's epistemology is not faith as a means of knowledge, not emotions or feelings are a means of knowledge, and not consensus as a means of knowledge, but reason, our faculty that makes us human, is our means of knowledge. How do we know what's true? We look at reality, we perceive what's real, we conceptualize the things that we perceive by forming concepts, cat, dog, animal, etc., and then the sophisticated, more abstract ideas, everything from humor to sarcasm to justice to individual rights to limited government, right? And this is how we figure out what is true in the world and how we can think long range by using abstractions and principles and the like. Principles such as the principle of individual rights. Human beings must be left free to act on their judgments so that they can live as human beings. This is what reason enables us to do if we use it and recognize that it is our means of knowledge. And that faith is not a means of knowledge. Accepting things as true because you just want to accept them as true is not a means of knowledge. Our feelings are not means of knowledge either, according to Rand and according to me. Our emotions are extremely important, don't get me wrong. There are emotional means of experiencing our values, or our psychological means of experiencing our values. They're very important, but they're not our means of knowledge. We have two mental faculties going on here, our emotional faculty and our conceptual or rational faculty, and they can work in harmony as long as we treat them as what they are, each for its specific purpose in our lives. And consensus certainly is not the means of knowledge, according to Rand. Just because people agree on something, this is the classic logical fallacy of appeal to the masses, right? That, oh, well, there's a consensus on this, that makes it true. That's just absurd. So Rand says that reason is our means of knowledge, and it helps us to access this one reality, bringing us down to metaphysics, the one reality in which we live, this one, the one we're trying to understand and live in and master so that we can flourish. She stands with Aristotle, who said of Plato's world of forms that it was senseless duplication to create another world that we then also have to worry about when there's no evidence for that world to begin with. Why duplicate reality? This one's difficult enough to figure out. Let's just figure this one out and live well in it. And to the postmodernists who claim there is no reality, or it's all just made up, everything's just a social construct. Well, I mean, that's pretty ridiculous. Is it a social construct that if you step in front of a speeding bus, you will die? Is it a social construct that Mahsa Amini is dead? Is it a social construct that the Ukrainians who are being slaughtered by Putin are being slaughtered? Or are these things real? Are they really happening in the world that we live in? The answer is relatively obvious. The claim that there is no reality or that we can't access reality is utterly absurd in the face of everything that we know to be true and all of the things that we do in this world. So I think there is a need for philosophy in the liberty movement. There's no question that we have to think about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, how people should and shouldn't act. We need ideas on this, and we need those ideas to correspond to reality, to the reality we know, the reality we live in. If they don't correspond to that reality, we can't demonstrate that they're true. And if you can't demonstrate that your advocacy of liberty is true, if you can't demonstrate that when the government spends more money and prints more money, that inflation happens, if you can't demonstrate that when a foreign aggressor invades a relatively free country and starts killing people, that those people actually, die, and if you can't explain that a young girl has a right to wear a hijab or not wear a hijab, and that no, quote, morality police with their faith as a means of knowledge get to say, well, we know something that obviates the need for you to live anymore. Philosophy matters, and I think that Ayn Rand's philosophy, if you look into it, you will see that it is the philosophy for freedom fighters. It is the philosophy that undergirds liberty and all of the things that we need to know and understand in order to protect liberty and advance liberty and bring liberty to the rest of the world. We've been at this, the liberty movement, for many, many decades. In fact, if we go back, we can take it all the way back, if you will, to Adam Smith, to the first economist who was trying to show that when people are free to produce and trade, that it rises everyone's standard of living. And that's true. And economics is an important science in the advancement and defense of liberty. But it is not the only science, and it is absolutely insufficient on its own. Absolutely insufficient on its own. We have lost ground in the fight for liberty in the economic realm, and we are losing ground in many other ways today, not only here, but around the world. And the solution to this problem is not to lose the economic argument, not to set that aside. Of course, we need to keep pointing out what happens when people are free and what happens to aggregates and cultures when they're free to produce and trade. But we need to integrate our economics with a rational, reality-based, egoistic, self-interested philosophy. And Ayn Rand's philosophy is precisely that. I want to recommend a few books. I think probably almost everyone in here has read Atlas Shrugged. It just seems to be almost ubiquitous in the liberty movement that people have read that. If you have not read it, however, I recommend highly that you do. It's a novel about, put it succinctly, it's a novel about a man who said he would stop the motor of the world and did. And it's a mystery novel about the disappearance of the producers in the world and what happens when they disappear and why. Rand's other books are The Fountainhead, which is about a wonderful architect named Howard Rourke and his intransigent commitment to designing buildings in his own style from his own rational perspective. And it's a really powerful story about integrity to one's values. And then Ayn Rand has, of course, all of her nonfiction, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which touches on some of the things I've talked about today, The Virtue of Selfishness, a new concept of egoism, which touches very directly on the things that I've talked about today. And one of my favorite books of Rand's, Philosophy, Who Needs It?, which is a survey, not of philosophy as such, but of specific issues in philosophy that really impinge on human life, liberty, and happiness. So I recommend you read these books, and if you're interested in taking courses on any of these topics, one of the organizations that I work with, Objective Standard Institute, which has tables out here at the conference, has constantly got courses going on talking about philosophy in general, not just Rand's philosophy, but philosophy in general, Rand's philosophy in particular, and the ways, and related ideas for living beautifully and defending liberty. Thank you all for your time today.